The night I turned 18, my dad looked me in the eye and said, "You were never my daughter. You're another man's mistake." He thought he was finally getting rid of me. What he didn't know was that the other man, my biological father he had secretly hated for years, was waiting outside in a black Mercedes to take me away. He didn't hand me the bill, he flicked it like trash, the folded rectangle slapping against my cheek before landing on the hardwood between us, and for a second all I could think about was how many nights I had tiptoed past that same spot, hoping not to make a sound that would annoy him. Richard stood there at the head of the kitchen table, the same place he had presided over every dinner like a bored judge, his expression almost relaxed, like he was signing off on a contract instead of ending 18 years of obligation. The house smelled like burnt coffee and cold toast, the remains of a breakfast I had not been invited to share, and Karen scrolled through her phone while Tyler hunched over his cereal, pretending none of this was happening because pretending was the one skill our family had always excelled at. Richard's voice was steady as he told me I was an adult now, that he had met his legal responsibilities, that he was done paying for another man's mistake, and the casual way he said it cut deeper than if he had screamed. I had imagined this moment for 10 years, ever since I was 8 and heard those words for the first time through a cracked hallway door. But imagining it and standing there with my skin still stinging from the paper were two very different things. I stared at the 50 lying on the floor between us, the face of Ulysses S. Grant looking up at me with the same detached indifference Richard had perfected. And I realized he had probably rehearsed this in his head, maybe even counted down to it on some internal calendar the way other parents counted down to graduations or weddings. To him, I wasn't a daughter. I was a line item, a sunk cost he could finally write off, and the knowledge settled over me like something I had always known, but never dared to say out loud. He didn't mention the recitals he had skipped, the birthdays he had spent working late, or the way he used to lower his voice, just enough that my mother thought I couldn't hear the insults drifting down the hallway. Yet all of those memories crowded the kitchen with us, ghosts sitting in the empty chairs. I thought about every time I had watched him sprint to Tyler's soccer games while my piano performances came and went without him, about every whispered argument I had pretended to sleep through, and it hit me that this wasn't a sudden decision. It was the moment he had been moving toward my entire life. I bent down, picked up the 50, and felt something inside me harden, not into hatred exactly, but into a kind of cold clarity that I wasn't going to beg this man for anything ever again. I slipped the bill into my pocket and finally stopped waiting. Because to understand how a girl ends up thrown out over $50, you have to go back to the first night she hears another man's mistake. I was 8 years old, standing in my socks in a dark hallway that smelled like pine sol and leftover spaghetti, listening to the man I called Dad say he was done pretending I was his child. I can still feel the way the carpet fibers scratched my ankles, the way my fingers dug into the edge of the wall, as if I could hold myself in place and keep the whole night from sliding off its axis. Just a few hours earlier, I had been on a tiny stage at Highlands Ranch Elementary, my legs shaking under my black recital dress, while I played Furalise on a slightly out-of-tune piano I had practiced on for 3 months straight. My mom sat in the front row in her favorite blue dress, the one she only wore for special occasions, filming every note on her phone like the rest of the world had disappeared. The chair beside her stayed empty, the reserved sign still folded on the seat. And every time I looked up from the keys and saw that emptiness, I told myself it didn't matter that Richard had a last-minute meeting, even though he somehow never had those when my little brother Tyler played soccer. After the recital, kids ran around the hallway with flowers and juice boxes, their parents laughing and hugging them like they had just headlined Carnegie Hall instead of an elementary school cafeteria. Mom found me by the trophy case, her eyes red in a way that didn't match her bright smile, as she told me I was wonderful and asked if I wanted ice cream to celebrate. I remember staring at the smear of mascara at the corner of her eye, at the way her voice wobbled when she called me baby. And before I could stop myself, I blurted out the question that had been pressing on my chest all year. Why doesn't Daddy ever come to my things? For a second, something raw flashed across her face, a kind of grief I didn't have words for yet, and instead of answering, she just pulled me into a hug that went on too long, her arms tight like she was trying to shield me from something she couldn't control. I let her because I was 8 and still believed that if my mother was holding me, nothing truly bad could happen. That night, the house was quiet in that heavy, grown-up way that made the air feel thick. I woke up thirsty, my throat dry, and patted down the stairs in my socks, careful to skip the creaky step I had learned to avoid. I stopped when I heard voices coming from the kitchen, low and sharp, the kind of voices adults use when they think kids are asleep. I should have gone back to bed, but something in my mother's tone made me freeze. I pressed myself against the wall, just outside the doorway, and listened. Richard's voice cut through first, flat and exhausted, saying he was done pretending, that every time he looked at me, he saw the mistake she had made. My mother whispered something I couldn't catch, and then he said it clearer, louder, like he wanted the words to hurt. She's not my child, she never was, and the day she turns 18, she's out of this house. Time did something strange in that moment. I didn't understand what kind of mistake could be a person, or how I could be living in a house with people who didn't seem to see me as real. But I understood the way my mother's voice cracked when she said I was a child, that I was innocent, that he couldn't talk about me like that. I understood the scrape of a chair, the slam of a cabinet, the awful silence that followed, and the quiet sound of my mother crying into her hands. I backed away from the doorway, suddenly more awake than I had ever been in my life. The phrase, another man's mistake, looping in my head like a song stuck on repeat. I climbed the stairs without getting the water I'd come for, crawled back into bed, and stared at the glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling, while my chest ached with a new, heavy kind of loneliness, the kind you feel when you realize the people you live with might not actually want you there at all. I didn't start counting down the days until I turned 18. I started counting the ways I seemed to be wrong, the ways I made my mother cry, the ways Richard's eyes slid past me at the dinner table, as if I were a shadow that had wandered into the wrong house. And as I got older, I began to notice something else too, a pattern that was harder than emotions and sharper than words. The difference between how they treated me and how they treated Tyler wasn't just about hugs and attention. It showed up on receipts, in credit card statements, in the things he got without asking and the things I was told we couldn't afford. And I quietly decided that if I was going to be a mistake in this house, I was at least going to be a mistake who learned how to keep score. Because someday, those numbers would matter more than anybody in that kitchen realized. By the time I was 16, I had already learned that in our house, love came with a receipt. And it turned out, my future was worth less than my brother's latest pair of cleats. I remember standing in the doorway of Richard's home office, clutching the SAT printout I'd gotten from my guidance counselor, the numbers and deadlines highlighted in yellow like they were glowing with possibility. His desk was covered in spreadsheets from Mercer Holloway Properties, columns of numbers and projections that seemed to hold his full attention in a way I never could. He didn't look up when I knocked, just muttered something that sounded like, "Make it quick." So I stepped inside and told him I needed $200 for the SAT registration and prep books. I tried to keep my voice neutral, businesslike, because experience had taught me that sounding emotional only made him impatient. He finally glanced at me, over the top of his glasses, not at the paper in my hand, not at my face, really, just at the inconvenience of my existence. Get a job, he said, like it was a punchline. I reminded him the deadline was in 2 weeks, that this was the test colleges expected, that it actually mattered. He shrugged and turned back to his screen. I can't just throw money at everyone, Athena. We're not made of cash. The thing about growing up in a house where you are constantly compared to someone else is that you eventually start running the math yourself. A week earlier, I had watched him swipe his card for Tyler's new soccer cleats, $350 for a 14-year-old who would outgrow them by Christmas. He hadn't blinked at the price. He had even joked with the cashier about investing in talent, ruffling Tyler's hair while my brother grinned and kicked at the air. No one told Tyler to get a job. No one suggested that his dreams were too expensive. When Richard told me he couldn't throw money at everyone, what he meant was that he couldn't justify spending $200 on the daughter he never wanted, even if that money was for something that might actually change her life. $200 for a college entrance exam was wasteful, but $350 on brand name leather to chase a ball across a field was an investment. I walked out of his office with my face carefully blank, but inside something ugly and familiar twisted tighter. That feeling of being the optional kid, the one who came with fine print and disclaimers. So I did exactly what he said. I got a job. Brood Awakening was a cramped coffee shop 3 blocks from school, the kind of place with mismatched mugs and a tip jar full of crumpled ones. And for 3 months I stood behind that counter, breathing in espresso steam and burnt milk, while my classmates posted pictures from football games and ski trips. I worked 15 hours a week at minimum wage, saving every dollar I could for the ESAT fee and the prep book I found on sale. I paid my own phone bill too, because when I turned 15, Richard had taken me off the family plan without warning, sliding my disconnected phone across the table and telling me it was time to be responsible. Meanwhile, every September, Tyler unboxed a brand new iPhone at the kitchen island like it was his birthright, peeling off the plastic while Karen cooed about how hard he worked at practice. When my SAT scores came back, 1480, 96th percentile, I printed the report and left it on the kitchen counter, right where everyone dumped their keys and mail, imagining for a second that maybe someone might say they were proud. The paper sat there all day, untouched, and by nightfall it was buried under a grocery flyer and an empty Amazon box addressed to Tyler. No one asked, no one mentioned it. It was like it had never existed. That was the day I quietly decided I was done, asking Richard for anything that could be measured in dollars. If I was going to build a life, it would be with hands that smelled like coffee and printer ink, not with money tossed at me like charity. I also stopped trusting my memory to hold the weight of all the unfairness and started writing it down instead. At first, it was just notes in the back of a school notebook. Dates, amounts, what Tyler got, what I was denied. But over time, it turned into a file. Screenshots of bank notifications, photos of receipts left on the counter, little pieces of proof that I wasn't crazy, that the imbalance I felt wasn't just in my head. I thought I was just keeping myself sane, giving shape to a pattern no one else wanted to acknowledge. I had no idea those numbers and scraps of paper would one day sit in a lawyer's conference room, turned into evidence that finally made Richard pay for every single choice he made about me. 3 days before my mother died, she wrapped her trembling fingers around my wrist, pulled me close in that humming hospital room, and made me promise I wouldn't open her last secret until I turned 16. The room smelled like antiseptic and cheap coffee, the kind that sits too long on a warmer, and the machine surrounding her bed beeped out a rhythm that felt like a countdown I could not stop. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, swallowed by thin white sheets and wires. But when she pointed to the corner where her nightstand sat, her voice carried a strength that didn't match her body. "In my jewelry box," she whispered. pausing to catch her breath. The one with the roses on the lid. There's a letter for you inside. I knew the box she meant. I'd watched her lift that painted lid my whole life to tuck away the pieces. She said we're too special for every day. I asked her why I couldn't read it now, why we had to wait, and she squeezed my hand with a grip that surprised me. When you're 16, you'll be old enough to understand and strong enough to handle it, she said. Promise me, Athena. I was 12, terrified and willing to agree to anything that might keep her with me even a little longer. So I nodded and promised, not realizing I was tying myself to a truth that would shatter everything I thought I knew. She died 3 days later, just after dawn, with my fingers laced through hers and Richard standing in the doorway, checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. I remember the way the nurse gently pulled the sheet up, the way the world outside the window kept moving, cars sliding through the parking lot, a delivery truck unloading boxes, as if the universe hadn't just torn a hole through the center of my life. The funeral blurred past in a haze of black clothes, casseroles, and people telling me how strong I was while I tried not to scream. Richard gave a short, stiff eulogy that mentioned my mother's loyalty and devotion, but never once looked at me. After everyone went home and the flowers started to wilt, the house became a museum of her absence, every room echoing with things she would never say again. 11 months later, Richard remarried. Karen arrived in a cloud of perfume and real estate brochures, smiling too brightly, calling me sweetie, like she could patch over my grief with manicures and throw pillows. Her first project as Mrs. Mercer was to freshen up the house, which apparently meant erasing every trace of the woman who had lived there before her. My mother's clothes disappeared into donation bags. Her books were boxed and labeled for storage. And one afternoon, I walked into the bedroom to find Karen holding the rose-covered jewelry box, turning it over in her hands like it was clutter. We'll send this up to the attic with the rest, she said. My chest went cold. I stepped forward so fast I startled her and grabbed the box. That's mine, I said, hugging it to my chest before I even realized I was moving. Karen blinked, then glanced toward the doorway where Richard stood watching. He shrugged and said, Let her keep it. It's just junk. It wasn't junk to me. It was the last promise I had made to my mother. The one thread connecting me to something she had wanted me to know long after she was gone. I took the box to my room and hid it in the back of my closet, behind winter coats that no longer fit, checking on it the way other kids checked on secret diaries or hidden cash. For 4 years, I guarded that box, moving it from shelf to shelf as Karen redecorated, dusting it off when her cleaning sprees came too close, all while the rest of my life tilted further off balance. Richard's resentment grew sharper, the financial double standards more blatant, and I found myself clinging to the idea that whatever waited inside that box might finally explain why I felt like a stranger in my own family. I didn't know if the letter would make things better or worse, only that it was a fuse waiting for the right birthday to be lit. On the morning of my 16th birthday, the house was empty. Karen had taken Tyler to an early soccer tournament, and Richard had left for the golf course, calling it a work event, even though he'd packed his clubs. Sunlight slanted across my bedroom floor as I pulled the jewelry box from the closet and set it on my bed, my hands shaking in a way I couldn't blame on caffeine. The roses painted on the lid were chipped at the edges, worn from years of being opened and closed. And when I lifted it, the familiar scent of my mother's perfume rose up like a ghost. Nestled beneath a tangle of unused necklaces and a strand of pearls was an envelope with my name written on it in her looping handwriting. Athena. My throat tightened. I sat down, smoothed the paper flat, and opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, dated 2 months before her diagnosis, and by the second paragraph, my world had split cleanly in two. Before I knew. And after, she told me that Richard was not my biological father, that before she married him, she had a brief relationship with a man named Marcus Holloway, and that she discovered she was pregnant only after he left to marry someone else. She admitted she made a decision she regretted, to marry Richard and let him believe I was his child, and that he had discovered the truth when I was 3 by finding a hidden DNA test. He had known for 15 years. She wrote that Marcus never knew I existed, that her attorney, a woman named Eleanor Vance, held a notarized copy of the letter, and she underlined one sentence so hard the pen had nearly torn the paper. "You are not a mistake, Athena." When I finished reading, I didn't cry. I just sat there on my bed with the letter open in my hands, my heart pounding, my mind replaying every cold look, every another man's mistake, every time Richard had chosen Tyler's wants over my needs. For the first time, the pieces fit together, the hatred in his eyes, the way he seemed personally offended by my existence, the way my mother had always seemed to be apologizing for something she never named. Now, I had a name, Marcus Holloway, a man I had never met, but who had shaped my life more than he would ever realize, and a choice I had never expected to face at 16. Did I protect the fragile life I had built in a house that didn't want me? Or did I risk everything and reach out to the man my mother had loved before she ever put my last name on a marriage certificate? The first time I typed my biological father's name into Google, I thought maybe I would find a LinkedIn profile or an old yearbook photo, not a man who had turned the industry Richard limped through into a multi-million-dollar empire. I sat on my bed with my laptop balanced on my knees, my mother's letter open beside me like a witness, and slowly entered the name, Marcus Holloway. The search results exploded across the screen in a way that made my stomach lurch. Article after article, press releases, interviews, financial profiles. Marcus Holloway, CEO and co-founder of Holloway Capital Partners, a private equity firm managing billions in assets, quote about market volatility and sustainable development as if he were some kind of economic weather god. I scrolled through images. Marcus at a podium in a dark suit, Marcus shaking hands with a governor, Marcus standing in front of a glass tower with a confident half smile, and in every picture his eyes were the same clear blue I saw in the mirror every morning. His hair was silver at the temples, his jawline sharp, his posture relaxed in a way that said he knew he belonged anywhere he stood. For a second, I forgot how to breathe, because it felt like looking at a version of myself, dropped into an entirely different life. The deeper I went, the more surreal it became. One Denver Business Journal article traced his career from early projects to massive developments, and my eyes snapped on a familiar name buried halfway down the page, Mercer Holloway Properties. According to the piece, Marcus had co-founded the company 20 years earlier, then left after strategic differences with his partner. The partner's name was one I knew by heart, Richard Mercer. I just sat there, blinking at the screen, as the puzzle pieces of my life rearranged themselves into a cruel little picture. The company Richard worked for, the title he loved to flaunt, Vice President at Mercer Holloway, carried my real father's last name because Marcus had helped build it and then outgrown it. All those years, I'd heard Richard raging at the dinner table about Holloway stealing another deal, and that arrogant bastard sabotaging my projects, and I had believed there were two separate men at war over real estate contracts. Now I understood that every rant, every bitter comment had really been about the man my mother loved. Before she ever put on a wedding dress for Richard, the man who had beaten him in business, and, whether he knew it or not, in genetics. It hit me like a physical blow that every time Richard looked at my face, he wasn't just seeing a reminder of my mother's mistake. He was seeing Marcus, the partner who had gone on to become everything he wanted to be. Suddenly, the coldness, the stinginess, the calculated neglect all felt less random and more like a private, daily revenge he took on a girl who looked too much like the rival he couldn't outrun. I stared at picture after picture of Marcus, photos from charity galas, company retreats, ribbon cuttings, and tried to imagine where I could possibly fit into that glossy life. Did he have kids? A wife? A perfect family arranged around him like a holiday card? The articles mentioned an ex wife, no current spouse, a string of high profile relationships, but nothing about children. A part of me swelled with something like hope. If he didn't have other kids, maybe there was a space for me. But another, harsher part whispered that men who lived in penthouses and flew to conferences in private jets didn't exactly dream about surprise teenage daughters showing up with old secrets and legal documents. So I didn't reach out. Not right away. I waited 6 months, letting the idea of him settle into my life the way a new scar fades from bright red to something you can bear to look at. During those months, I watched Richard more closely, listened to how his voice sharpened whenever Marcus's name came up in the business pages, and quietly built a plan. If I was going to contact Marcus, I wasn't going to do it with a desperate email that could be ignored or deleted. I was going to do it like someone who understood how men like him operated, on paper, with evidence, through official channels. On a gray Saturday afternoon, I sat at my desk with my mother's letter beside me and wrote my own, explaining who I was, enclosing a copy of her notarized confession, and asking for one simple thing, an independent DNA test to confirm what the ink on those pages already screamed. When I sealed the envelope and addressed it to Holloway Capital Partners, my hands were shaking so hard I almost couldn't press the stamp down. Then I walked to the end of the street, stood in front of the blue mailbox, and slid the letter through the slot, listening to it clatter into the dark. In that moment, I knew I might have just detonated both of their lives, or proved that I was unwanted by not one man, but two. The day an attorney for Marcus Holloway emailed me agreeing to a DNA test, the name I had only seen in headlines suddenly stepped out of my laptop screen and into my real life. Until that moment, Marcus had been almost theoretical, a possibility tucked between 3 pages of my mother's handwriting and a dozen online articles. But seeing his lawyer's signature beneath a calm, professional paragraph about confirming paternity made my hands go slick with sweat. They had already scheduled an appointment at a certified lab downtown, explained the process, emphasized confidentiality. It was all very clinical, methodical, and that somehow made it even more terrifying. Because clinical meant real, and real meant that within a few weeks, I would have to stop hiding in the uncertainty between two men and face the truth about which one's DNA was actually living in my bones. The lab itself was smaller than I expected, tucked into a medical building that smelled like rubbing alcohol and printer paper. A nurse in navy scrubs led me into a room with beige walls and a framed poster about genetic markers, chatting casually about the weather as if she weren't about to answer the biggest question of my life with a cotton swab. The actual test took less than 5 minutes. I signed some documents, swished mouthwash, held it still while she rubbed the swab along the inside of my cheek, and watched her label the vial with a barcode and my name in black ink. There was no dramatic music, no thunderclap, just the quiet click of a cooler closing and the soft hum of a refrigerator as she stored the sample away beside hundreds of others. She told me results typically took about 2 weeks, and I walked out into the parking lot, feeling like I had just handed over a piece of myself I could never get back. Waiting for those results stretched time into something cruel. I went to school, worked my shifts at Brood Awakening, did my homework at the kitchen table under Richard's disinterested gaze, and all the while a clock I couldn't see ticked down, toward an answer that would either open a door or slam it shut forever. At night, lying in my bed in the house where I was still treated like an unwanted guest, I would imagine different outcomes. If the test said no, if Marcus wasn't my father, then I had gambled away the last illusion I had. And Richard's hatred would become even more suffocating because it would be backed by another man's rejection. If it said yes, then I would be tethered to someone who hadn't known I existed for 16 years, a stranger with my eyes and my mother's past, and I would have to decide what to do with that connection. 2 weeks later, an envelope from the lab arrived, thin and unremarkable, like a credit card offer instead of the verdict on my entire origin story. I took it to my room, closed the door, sat on the bed, and opened it with hands that would not stop shaking. The report was written in dense, technical language, tables of alleles and markers that meant nothing to me until I reached the line that did probability of paternity, 999.97%. I read it 3 times before the words settled into meaning. Marcus was my biological father. Not maybe, not probably, almost certainly in the kind of numbers scientists and courts took seriously. I waited for tears, for some cinematic flood of emotion. But what came first was a strange stillness, like my body finally aligning with a story that had always been true underneath the lies. 3 days later, my phone rang with an unfamiliar Denver number. For a heartbeat, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but some instinct made me swipe accept and lift it to my ear. The voice on the other end was deeper than I expected, controlled, with the kind of calm people develop when they spend their lives leading boardrooms. "Athena," he said, pronouncing my name carefully. "This is Marcus Holloway. I just received the test results." Hearing his name and mine in the same sentence from his mouth jolted something loose in my chest. Before I could stammer out a response, he went on. He told me he had not known about me, that my mother had never said a word, and that when his attorney first showed him the letter and the lab's confirmation, his first reaction was not anger, but regret for all the birthdays and school years he had missed. "I can't change the past," he said quietly. "But now that I know you're my daughter, I'm not going anywhere." We agreed to meet in public, somewhere neutral, a downtown coffee shop with big windows and the kind of exposed brick that made it look like the background of a commercial. I got there early and sat at a table by the window, fingers wrapped around a mug I barely drank from, watching every man in a dark coat who walked through the door. When Marcus finally came in, I recognized him instantly, not from the articles, but from the way his eyes scanned the room until they landed on me and softened. He approached the table, and when he sat down across from me, it was like looking into a future where my life had taken a completely different route. We talked for 2 hours, careful at first, then deeper, circling around my mother, how they had met, why they ended, how he had built his career while she married someone else and raised a child he didn't know was his. He apologized more than once, not in the defensive way people do when they are trying to protect themselves, but with a genuine sorrow that he had missed my childhood, missed being there the first time I played Furalise, or brought home an SAT score no one acknowledged. Over the next few months, we built something fragile and deliberate. Coffee once a week turned into lunch. Then occasional drives where he showed me parts of the city he had developed, pointing out buildings like they were chapters of his own story. He never pushed, never tried to swoop in and play instant dad, which somehow made it easier to trust him. Meanwhile, back at home, I still slept under Richard's roof, sat at his table, and listened to him complain about Holloway stealing contracts, not knowing his former partner was quietly taking me to dinner on Thursdays. The secret sat between my double life like a fault line, and I knew it couldn't hold forever. Eventually, our conversation shifted from the past to what came next, to the date Richard had snarled about when I was 8. The birthday he had promised would be my eviction notice. March 15th, my 18th birthday, circled itself on my calendar whether I wanted it to or not. Marcus didn't try to talk me into anything. He simply said that if Richard did what he had threatened to do, I would not have to face it alone. We worked out the details slowly, quietly, like planning a heist that was really a rescue. The time he would arrive on my street, where he would park so he could see the front door, what documents he would bring, a copy of the DNA results, a copy of my mother's letter, and something else he would not explain yet. We both knew Richard well enough to understand he would make my last day in that house as cruel as possible, that the $50 he'd been saving up as an insult would not be the only weapon he tried to use, and we wanted to be ready. So, when March 15th finally came, I woke up knowing that whether Richard threw me out or not, I would be walking out of that house for the last time. And for the first time in my life, my father would be waiting for me on the other side of the door. On the morning of my 18th, the house felt like a courtroom. No happy birthday, no cake, just a thick silence and a black Mercedes. In the kitchen, life went. Morning of my life. Except today, I could feel his awareness of me like static in the air, even though he didn't look up. I poured myself a glass of orange juice, my hand steady, the weight in my jacket pocket anchoring me more than any breakfast ever could. Inside that pocket was the envelope, the DNA results from the lab, a copy of my mother's letter, and a photo of Marcus and me, taken at a downtown coffee shop, both of us caught mid-laugh like we belonged in the same frame. I sat down at the far end of the table, the way I always had, the invisible child occupying the leftover chair. No one said a word. The clock over the stove ticked louder than usual, counting off the last seconds of the life Richard had built on silence and secrets. He finished the article he was pretending to read, folded the paper with care, and set it aside. When he finally looked at me, there was a strange lightness in his eyes, the satisfaction of a man who believes he's about to check off a long-awaited task. "We need to talk," he said, his tone flat, almost Borat. Karen glanced up, then quickly back down at her phone, as if she could hide inside whatever group chat she was scrolling. Tyler paused his video, sensing the shift. Richard reached into his wallet, pulled out a single $50 bill, and instead of handing it to me, he flicked it across the table. It hit my wrist and tumbled onto the placemat. "You're 18 now," he said. "I'm done. I've met my legal obligation. I'm not paying for another man's mistake." The words landed with a dull thought, but they didn't split me open the way they might have 2 years earlier, because now I knew exactly which man he meant, and exactly how wrong he was about who the mistake really belonged to. I picked up the bill, turned it between my fingers, and for a second I imagined being 8 again, barefoot in the hallway, hearing those same words and having no idea why my mother cried. Then I slid the 50 into my pocket with the envelope and looked him in the eye. "You think you're telling me something, keeping my voice, but I've known the truth." His expression flickered, confusion cracking his. I reached into my open it. For a moment he didn't move. Then curiosity or fear won, and he tore it. I watched his eyes. "You went to him." "My father," head snapped toward the glass. From where he sat, he could see the black Mercedes, could see the driver's door open, could see Marcus unfold himself from the car in a charcoal overcoat, straightening his shoulders like a man who has walked into far less friendly rooms and still won. Karen's phone slipped slightly in her hand as she followed Richard's stare. Tyler turned all the way around, his eyes wide. Before anyone could speak, the doorbell rang, the sound echoing through the foyer in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand up. No one moved. It rang again. "I'll get it," I said, standing. As I walked down the hall, I could feel Richard's gaze burning into my back, could almost hear the gears grinding as I tried to reconcile his favorite insult with the reality materializing on his front porch. I opened the door, and there was Marcus, taller than I remembered from the coffee shop. His silver hair immaculately in place despite the wind, his blue eyes, my eyes, steady. "Ready?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside. "Come in." Marcus didn't hesitate. He stepped over the threshold like he had every right to be there, because on some level he did. In the kitchen, the air tightened as he entered. Richard stood, his chair scraping back, his face a mixture of rage and panic. "Get out of my house," he snapped. Marcus offered a small, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, Richard. I'm here to collect my daughter, the one you just tried to buy off with $50. His gaze flicked to the spot where I'd been sitting, then to the envelope in Richard's hand. "I see she gave you the paperwork." What followed didn't feel like a conversation. It felt like a controlled demolition. Marcus laid it all out with the precision of a man used to presenting two boards. The trust fund my mother had established for me, naming Richard as guardian. The bank statements showing $47,000 siphoned off over 5 years. The email Richard had sent his lawyer years ago asking how to cut a non-biological child out of his will, and what would happen if he removed her from the household before 18. Karen went pale as Marcus slid copies of those documents onto the counter, her eyes darting from the numbers to Richard's face. Tyler's mouth hung open. Richard tried to sputter excuses. Raising a child is expensive. He had a right to the money. This was a private family matter. But Marcus shut each one down with dates, amounts, signatures. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the upcoming Denver Chamber of Commerce gala, the one where Richard was scheduled to receive a Developer of the Year award, and said, "By the end of that night, everyone you've spent your life trying to impress will know exactly what you've done to Athena." The room seemed to tilt. For the first time in my life, I watched fear, not contempt, flicker across Richard's face. He looked smaller somehow, clutching crumpled papers that revealed the ugliness he'd always managed to hide behind closed doors. Marcus turned to me and held out his hand. "Are you ready to go?" he asked, like this was any other departure, like we were just leaving a bad dinner party instead of the only home I'd ever known. I looked around the kitchen one last time, the table where I'd done homework alone, the counter where my SAT score had disappeared under junk mail, the doorway where I had stood barefoot at 8 years old and learned I was another man's mistake, and felt a strange, clean lightness. I picked up my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and walked to Marcus's side. Richard didn't say my name. He didn't apologize. He just stood there, holding the shredded remains of his secrets while everything he'd tried to bury started to surface. What he didn't understand was that the worst was still coming, and the next time he saw my face, it would be under a spotlight, in a ballroom full of people watching his entire reputation collapse in real time. The first night I slept in Marcus's guest apartment, I thought the worst was finally over, but it turned out Richard was just switching from open warfare to sabotage in the dark. The apartment sat high above downtown Denver, all glass and quiet, the kind of place where you could actually hear yourself think. I woke to sunlight instead of slammed doors, to the hum of the city instead of Richard's clipped footsteps in the hallway. And for a few days, I let myself believe I was safe. Marcus gave me my own room, my own key, and more space than I'd ever had in that 4-bedroom house in Highlands Ranch, where I'd always felt like a permanent guest. I unpacked my boxes slowly, arranging my few books on the shelves, pinning up photos I'd never dared to print before, and for the first time in 18 years, the air around me didn't feel hostile. But people like Richard don't give up power gracefully. They just look for new ways to pull the strings they think they still hold. The first hit, came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after I moved out. My high school principal called, her tone careful, asking if I could stop by her office after last period. When I sat down across from her, she folded her hands and told me Richard had contacted the school. He described me as emotionally unstable, said I had a history of lying about the family, suggested I might need a psychological evaluation before graduation. Hearing his accusations laid out in a calm, administrative voice made my stomach twist, even though she quickly added that she didn't believe him. She'd known me for 4 years, seen my grades, my behavior, my work at Brood Awakening, and none of it matched the picture he tried to paint. I nodded, like it was fine, like it rolled off me. But when I left her office, my hands were shaking. 2 days later, an email arrived from the University of Colorado's financial aid office, politely requesting a meeting about inconsistencies in my application and questions regarding guardianship status. I didn't need a law degree to know exactly who had fed them those concerns. When I showed the email to Marcus, he read it once, then forwarded it to Eleanor with a few short lines I couldn't see. "Let us handle this," he told me. "Richard is digging his own grave now. All we have to do is stop him from pulling you in with him." The next week was a blur of calls I wasn't on and meetings I didn't attend. Eleanor spoke with my principal and the university, explained the context, provided documentation showing I was legally allowed to represent my own financial situation, and gently reminded them that retaliatory accusations from a disgruntled guardian tended to look very bad if they ever saw daylight. While she worked behind the scenes, Marcus sat me down at his kitchen island and told me about an upcoming event I'd never imagined myself attending: the Denver Chamber of Commerce Charity Gala. 400 guests, black tie, champagne, silent auction, the whole world Richard worshipped. "They're honoring him as Developer of the Year," Marcus said, his mouth curving into a humorless smile. "And I'm the lead sponsor." He explained that as a sponsor, he would have 10 minutes on stage, 10 minutes to tell a story he'd avoided for 2 decades, and he planned to use them to lay out the truth about me, about my mother, about the trust fund and the man who had drained it. No drama, no shouting, just facts, documents, receipts projected onto a screen while the entire room watched. A few days before the gala, a box appeared on the bed in my room at the apartment. Inside was a navy gown, simple and elegant, with a neckline that didn't make me feel like I was playing dress up in someone else's life. "If you're comfortable, I'd like you there," Marcus said, "but it's your choice." I thought about every time Richard had gushed about this gala, the years he had campaigned for that award, the way he lit up when people in his world nodded at him in expensive hotel lobbies, and something inside me said, "I'm coming." Walking into the Four Seasons felt like stepping onto crystal chandeliers, waiters, investors. His eyes slid over the room, landed on Marcus, then on me at his side, and his face went from smug to stormy in 3 seconds. He abandoned his circle and strode toward us, Karen trailing a step behind, her smile frozen. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" he hissed, not even bothering with the greeting. Conversations around us faltered as people turned to listen, sensing drama the way sharks sense blood in the water. "I was invited," I said, keeping my voice even. "My father is the lead sponsor." I didn't raise my volume, but the word father might as well have been shouted into a microphone. Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that didn't match the string quartet playing in the background. "Your father?" he snapped. "This girl is not my daughter. She's the product of my late wife's affair, a bastard I took care of out of charity for 18 years. Gasps rippled through the group. I saw phones come out, screens angling toward us. He kept going, ranting about how I was ungrateful, how I'd repaid his sacrifice by parading around with the man who'd tried to ruin him, spitting out words like liar and manipulator like they were absolutions for his own behavior. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I just stood there and let him dig, because every sentence he threw at me in that crowded ballroom was another shovel of dirt onto the image he'd spent his life curating. By the time the host tapped the microphone and asked everyone to take their seats so Mr. Holloway could begin his remarks, the room was already buzzing with one story, and none of them realized the real show hadn't even started yet. When I heard my name announced in front of 400 people, followed by the words, my daughter, it felt like the entire ballroom tilted and every version of me that had ever been ignored was suddenly dragged into the light. Marcus stood at the podium under the wash of the stage lights, the Chamber of Commerce logo glowing behind him, and the room, which had been buzzing with small talk and the clink of glassware, fell into a waiting hush. He hadn't started with me. He had started with them, with the crowd that lived for deals and optics, talking about family, regret, and the way one choice can echo for decades. He admitted he once walked away from a woman he cared about, convinced himself he was doing the right thing, and never knew she was carrying his child. There was a rustle of interest at that, the kind of collective leaning that happens when powerful people. Then Marcus said a young woman had not asking for money, but for the truth. He turned, standing up. I walked between the tables, aware of every stare, every whispered, who is she? And is that the girl from the bar? From people who had watched Richard publicly disown me 20 minutes earlier. By the time I reached the steps to the stage, my palms were damp, but my spine was straight. Marcus took my hand and helped me up beside him, then faced the crowd with a calm that made it clear he was exactly where he'd always believed he belonged. This is my daughter, he said into the microphone, his hand resting lightly at my back. Athena Anderson. I hope one day she'll let me call her Athena Holloway. A ripple passed through the room. Some applause, some shock, some people too stunned to move. I stood there under the lights, not hiding, not apologizing, and for the first time in my life, the word daughter didn't sound like a weapon. Marcus didn't give them time to settle. He told them about my grades, my 3.9 GPA, the 96th percentile SAT score, and then he dropped the detail that made the room's temperature change. That I had paid for that SAT myself by working at a coffee shop, because my legal guardian refused to give me $200 while spending hundreds on luxuries for his biological son. Faces turned toward Richard's table, where he sat rigid, Karen frozen beside him. In spite of that, Marcus continued, she still built a future for herself. She did everything right while being treated as if she didn't belong in her own home. Then, he gestured to the side of the stage, where Eleanor waited in a tailored gray suit, holding a slim folder like a scalpel. For those who value facts over gossip, I'd like to introduce our counsel, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor stepped up to the microphone with the unhurried confidence of someone who has walked into courtrooms for a living. She laid it out cleanly. The notarized letter my mother had written, dated before her diagnosis, stating that Marcus was my biological father. The certified DNA test from the lab confirming a 97% probability of paternity. And finally, the bank records. She explained that Richard, as trustee of my inheritance, had withdrawn $47,000 over 5 years for child-related expenses that never reached me. Legal action to recover these funds, with interest and fees, will begin Monday morning, she said. Her voice didn't rise, but the words landed like dropped stones. You could feel the room shift as people did their own mental math, not just about the money, but about the ethics of a man they had been prepared to applaud. Richard shot to his feet, knocking his chair back with a clatter. This is a lie, he shouted, his voice cracking. The test is fake. The documents are forged. Marcus has been trying to destroy me for 20 years, and now he's using that girl to do it. A few people flinched at that girl. More remembered hearing him call me a bastard at the bar. Marcus didn't even flinch. He simply asked calmly whether Richard believed a national lab had joined the conspiracy, whether my mother had somehow anticipated all of this, years in advance just to frame him from beyond the grave. From the tables, voices started calling out, not in support, but in questions. What about the trust fund, Richard? 47,000 from a kid's inheritance. You bragged about that award for months. Chairs scraped as people edged away from his table, the physical distance mirroring the sudden social one. Richard's eyes stared around the room, looking for an ally and finding only cameras. Someone near the back yelled, "Running already, Mercer," as he turned toward the exit. He spun back, red-faced, spewing one last string of accusations about ungrateful children and lying wives. But the power had gone out of his words. They weren't listening anymore. They were watching him unravel. After a moment that stretched just long enough to be unforgettable, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out through a side door, Karen hurrying after him, leaving a full table, a half-drunk glass of champagne, and a reputation collapsing in his wake. I felt Marcus squeeze my shoulder, a silent question. "Are you okay?" And I nodded, because for the first time I truly was. As I stepped down from that stage to the sound of low murmurs and hurried texts, I knew that when Monday came, this wouldn't just be a story people whispered about at galas. It would have my name at the top of a legal complaint that finally forced Richard to answer for everything he'd done. The Monday after the gala, I opened my email and saw my name at the top of a legal complaint. Plaintiff, Athena Anderson. Defendant, Richard Mercer. And for the first time in my life, the power dynamic between us existed in writing, on my side. Eleanor had warned me it would feel surreal, that seeing the case captioned would hit harder than all the planning conversations. And she was right. The document was clinical, filed in Denver County Court, full of phrases like breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of trust assets. But beneath the legal language, I could hear the translation. After 18 years of being treated like I didn't matter, the state of Colorado was formally acknowledging that what Richard did to me was wrong. He wasn't just a cruel man anymore. He was a defendant. Eleanor walked me through the complaint line by line in her office, her tone measured, her confidence steady. She explained how the bank statements traced every withdrawal Richard had made from my trust, how the highlighted lines showed funds labeled as Athena, school, and Athena, expenses, that never touched my life. She reminded me that my own testimony, that I had paid for my S8, my phone, my clothes, my school activities with wages from Brood Awakening, filled in the gaps between the numbers. Judges like paper, she said, tapping the Yazar's stack of exhibits, and you've been unknowingly collecting it for years. At the same time, she was handling the university issue. After a single conversation with her, the financial aid office backed off completely, sending me a formal apology for the miscommunication and confirming that my admission and aid were secure. Richard's attempt to sabotage my future had backfired so completely that it now lived inside a manila folder marked evidence. While the legal process creaked into motion, the social fallout from the gala did its own kind of damage. Richard's name disappeared from the chamber's promotional materials. The Developer of the Year award was quietly postponed. Marcus's contacts inside Mercer Holloway reported tense board meetings, urgent strategy calls, whispered conversations in hallways. Fewer than 3 weeks after the filing, Eleanor received a call from a lawyer representing Richard. He wanted to talk settlement. He doesn't want discovery, she told me, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. If this goes forward, we get to look at everything. Emails, internal memos, more financial records. He can't risk that. The offer that eventually came across her desk was blunt. Repayment of the entire $47,000 he had taken, plus interest, plus Eleanor's fees, plus an immediate transfer of the remaining trust fund balance into an account in my name. No admissions on his part, of course. Men like Richard would rather bleed money than say the words, "I was wrong." I didn't go to the meeting where they signed the settlement. I didn't want to see his face or give him the satisfaction of gauging my reaction. Instead, I sat in a campus coffee shop with my laptop open, pretending to study while my phone buzzed periodically with brief updates from Eleanor. "He's late. He looks terrible. We're almost done." When the final message came, "It's signed." I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. 3 days later, I opened my banking app and stared at the new balance, the number suddenly $200,000 higher than they had been. It didn't feel like winning the lottery. It felt like someone had finally gone back and marked all the wrong answers on a test I'd been forced to take since childhood. The money was undeniably life-changing, but what made my chest tighten was the symbolism. There it was, in black and white. Proof that the way he'd treated me wasn't just how families are. It was a harm the law recognized, and he had literally paid for it. Marcus took me to dinner at a quiet Italian place that night, the kind with candles on the tables and waiters who remembered his name. After we ordered, he cleared his throat and said he wanted to make something clear. He offered to cover every cent of my college expenses: tuition, books, housing, all of it. On top of the trust fund, no strings attached. For a moment, the scared part of me wanted to say yes, to finally stop worrying about every dollar, to let someone else carry the burden. But another part, the part that had saved for the chat and walked to late shifts in the snow, spoke louder. I told him I was grateful, that the offer meant more than he realized, but that I needed to do this on my own terms. I would use the trust fund my mother left me and the scholarship I had earned. I didn't want my new life to swing from one man's grudging support to another man's generosity, even if this man loved me. Marcus listened, really listened, and then nodded. "All right," he said. "Just know the door is open. My help is there if you ever decide you want it. But I won't push, and I will never use money to control you." For the first time, I believed him. For a little while after that, things were quiet. The checks had cleared. The case was closed. The articles about the gala had faded beneath newer scandals in Denver's business, and I let myself imagine that the story was finally winding down. I focused on graduation, on course catalogs and dorm options, on learning what my life looked like when Richard was not. Then, a few months later, his name popped up in my email, the subject line, and I had one more choice to make about where this story ended. After everything he had, the first time it was with a calm, asking if or hovering as if opening them. By then, the fallout from the chamber had quietly poured. He had spent a $12 million collapsed. Not long after, the house in High. Listen to him call me another man's mistake. The bedroom that used to hold my mother's jewelry box, now staged with neutral art and a vase of fake flowers. Karen disappeared from social media almost overnight. Her Instagram, once packed with filtered photos of charity luncheons and tennis leagues, went private and then blank. It was like the life they'd constructed had been scrubbed from view, leaving only a few stubborn remnants cached in search results. The only person from that house who reached out to me in a way that felt real was Tyler. He texted one night out of nowhere, his name appearing on my phone for the first time since I'd left. He wrote that he was sorry, that he hadn't understood how bad it was for me, that he had believed what their dad said, because it was easier than asking questions. I sat with the message for a long time, torn between the instinct to comfort him and the need to protect myself. In the end, I told him I appreciated him saying it, that I wasn't ready to talk yet, and that maybe someday I would be. It was the truth, even if it wasn't the neat forgiveness he probably hoped for. Richard's email was different. It was 3 paragraphs of smooth, self conscious language about how he'd had time to reflect, how he might have made mistakes, how he wanted to offer context, and maybe apologize if that would help me heal. There was no mention of the specific things he'd done, just vague nods at tension and misunderstandings. Like 18 years of neglect and cruelty could be folded into a couple of neutral nouns. Every line felt less like remorse and more like damage control, another attempt to manage how he looked in the story, even now that the story was no longer his to control. I knew one thing for certain. I was not going to reply from my personal account and let him drag me back into the same warped dynamic where he spoke and I scrambled to justify my feelings. Instead, I forwarded the email to Eleanor. I want to respond, I told her, but I want it to be official and I want it to be the last time. She understood immediately. A few days later, she sent me a draft on her firm's letterhead and asked if it sounded like my voice. It did. The letter acknowledged his message, then laid out my position in clean, unemotional sentences. It said he had 18 years to treat me with basic decency and chose not to. It stated that he had used my parentage as justification for emotional abuse, for misusing my inheritance, for attempting to sabotage my education and reputation when I finally left. It made it clear that this was not about revenge. It was about a boundary. The last line said, simply, that I did not wish to have any further contact, and asked him not to reach out again in any form. I read it twice, felt something unclench in my chest, and told her to send it. When she did, it shifted our history into something official, not a messy family argument, but a record of harm and a decision to step away. He never replied, and for once, his silence felt like safety. While that chapter was closing, something much quieter and more surprising was happening in Denver and Boulder and all the miles between. My relationship with Marcus shifted from cautious and formal to something that started to look like an actual father-daughter bond. We started a tradition of Sunday brunch once a month, usually at the same cafe on Pearl Street, or a diner halfway between the city and my campus, where he'd try a new omelette every time, and I'd order the same avocado toast, because I'm the kind of person who likes one reliable thing on the menu. We filled in the gaps of 18 missing years in small stories. Him telling me about the first building he ever developed, me telling him about the time I played Furalise alone in that elementary school gym. We argued about music and movies, discovered we both hated cilantro, and loved old jazz records, and learned how to exist around each other without flinching. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward pauses and missteps, moments where he was too careful and I was too defensive. But underneath all of it was a steady fact. He kept showing up. On my 19th birthday, I didn't wake up in a house that wanted me gone. I woke up in my tiny Boulder apartment with textbooks stacked on the coffee table and the view of the Flatirons turning pink in the early light. That evening, Marcus drove up from Denver with a small bakery cake and a single candle, because he said 19 deserved at least one wish. We sat on my second-hand couch, plates balanced on our knees, watching the sun slide down the mountains, and he told me he was proud of me, not for surviving what I'd been through, though he was, but for the choices I was making now. When he said, "Happy birthday, Athena," something in his voice made my throat tighten. I took a breath, felt the weight of the year behind me, and answered without overthinking it. "Thanks, Dad." The word came out softer than I expected, but it hung there between us, real and solid. He didn't make a big deal of it. His eyes just went a little shinier, and he smiled in this quiet, almost relieved way that told me he'd been waiting, but not demanding. In that moment, with my past formally behind me and a new kind of family sitting on my thrift store couch eating store bought cake, I realized the story wasn't just about what had been taken from me. It was about what I was finally free. With Richard finally out and a father I chose to claim, I had to ask myself if my future really belonged only to what kind of life was I. Sometimes I stand in the middle of their apartment, barefoot on, and it hits me that this life, these walls, this view, this version of me was built entirely out of the pieces Richard tried so hard to break. The place isn't glamorous, the couch is secondhand, the kitchen cabinets stick when the weather changes, and my bedroom window whistles when the wind comes down off the mountains. But every corner of it feels like something I earned. My mornings start with alarms for classes instead of the sound of doors slamming. I pack my backpack with business textbooks, grab coffee on my way to campus, and spend my afternoons juggling lectures with a part time job at a small local real estate office downtown, answering phones and organizing files for agents who actually say thank you when I stay late. At night, I sit at my thrift store desk, budgeting the trust fund my mother left me, watching the numbers stretch across the semesters, and realizing that for the first time in my life, my future feels like something I'm actively building instead of something I'm just trying to survive. If you had told the girl counting days on the glow in the dark ceiling of her childhood bedroom that one day she would wake up without dread, she wouldn't have believed you. But that's what it feels like now. I wake up, and my first thought is not, what mood is he in? But what can I do with today? Somewhere between the $50 bill on the kitchen table and the moment I watched Richard walk out of that ballroom, I learned some things I wish I'd known sooner. I learned that my worth was never determined by the man who resented raising me, that boundaries are not cruelty, they are self defense, and that family is as much about the people who choose to show up for you as the ones whose DNA you share. I'm studying business with a focus on real estate. Not because I'm trying to beat Marcus or prove something to Richard, but because I want to know deep in my bones that I can create something from nothing, that I can take the same industry that was used to measure my value and make it into something that belongs to me. I know a lot of you watching this have lived your own versions of my story. Maybe your parent didn't throw $50 at you, but they threw words that felt just as cheap. Maybe you were the overlooked kid, the one who did everything right and still got treated like an afterthought, the one who learned to read the room before you learned to read your own report card. If any of that sounds familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not a mistake. The people who failed to love you the way you deserved do not get to define you, and they absolutely do not get to write your final chapter. Cutting someone off after years of emotional damage is not bitterness. It is survival. You do not owe abusers access to the healed version of you just because they suddenly decide they're ready to say sorry when the consequences finally land. When I look back now, from the hallway where I first heard another man's mistake, to the coffee shop shifts that paid for my SAT, to the hospital room where my mother pressed a secret into my hands, to the gala stage where Marcus called me his daughter, to the day the settlement cleared and I chose not to let another man's money define me. I see a story that is less about revenge and more about reclamation. Justice, for me, doesn't look like some dramatic movie scene. It looks like quiet peace, like being able to breathe in my own space, like choosing who gets to be in my life and who doesn't, like saying that to the man who earned it and never again to the man who didn't. So now, Iwena, I want to ask you something, because this is the part where your voice matters too. If you were me, would you have replied to Richard's email and given him another chance to explain? Or would you have done exactly what I did and closed that door for good? Comment, yes, if you would have answered him. No, if you agree with my boundary and tell me why. Because somewhere out there, someone is trying to decide if they're allowed to walk away. and your perspective might help them. If this story resonated with you, subscribe and stay. There are more stories coming about reclaiming your voice, setting hard boundaries, and learning you were never the problem to begin with. Because as long as there are invisible kids standing in dark hallways, I'm not done telling the truth about what it looks like to finally step into the light. If you made it all the way to the end with me, I want to hear from you. If you were in my place, would you have answered Richard's email or cut him off the way I did? Comment yes if you would have given him another chance, or no if you agree with my boundary, and tell me why. If this story made you feel seen or less alone, hit like so YouTube knows stories like this matter, and share it with someone who needs to hear they are not a mistake. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next chapter, because I am not done telling the truth for every invisible kid who is still living where I used to be.